the introduction. Oh,
there we go.
Thanks, Max, for the introduction, and thanks everyone for joining. And UK Youth for Nature is a great organisation, so it's really nice for people like for me to know that there's like a generation of people who really care about this issue, and that's just so important. So what you do is really crucial, and there's so many people that speak up for the climate, which is great. And I'd really love to see more people speaking up and taking action on nature. So it's really nice to be talking at this event. This is kind of, I've sort of got a vague structure of things that I want to talk to you guys about, and then I'm really interested to hear your questions and hear about, I don't know, like your thoughts on writing about nature, or what you think maybe is good or bad about Guardian coverage. So really interesting to have to hear from all of you as well. So to start off, I work at the Guardian's Age of Extinction project. So this was a project that was set up specifically to write about biodiversity loss. Obviously, already at the Guardian, there's lots of coverage of biodiversity loss, but we're realizing that this is a really big issue. So we have a specific desk for it, which is what I work on. And it's called Age of Extinction. It was set up in 2019. And it was kind of set up in anticipation of COP15 in Montreal, which is now happening in December this year. It's been delayed 4 times or something, 4 or 5 times. It was meant to happen in 2020. But that was our aim setting this desk up, that we realized we have a huge opportunity now for nature. We're going to set the next 10 years of UN targets, and they need to be good, and we need to make sure that people stick to them. In the past, the Aichi targets made in 2010, I think the world failed on every single one of those 20 targets for nature. So we're doing a really bad job, and I'm sure you guys all sort of struggle to, there's so much bad news around, especially now in the UK, with the government doing lots of things that seems quite backwards for nature. And it's quite difficult to constantly be working in this area and caring about nature and see what's happening. But it also means that what you do is more important than ever. And the government does listen to people, we hope. So, you know, we all need to keep doing what we're doing. So anyway, back to the Age of Extinction. So I've worked at the Guardian for about coming up for 3 years. And before that, I kind of had quite an unconventional route into nature journalism, in that I started at the Mail Online, which I'm sure lots of you are familiar with, but it's not like a classic sort of publication you go to for nature news. So I started writing about science and technology there, and I worked there for 2 years. And then gradually I worked at the Independent, worked a bit at the Sun, the Daily Mail paper, the Evening Standard, so kind of worked at lots of different places, and then eventually was lucky enough to find myself working at the Guardian. And one thing I definitely struggled with before I got to the Guardian was a frustration that there wasn't enough coverage of nature issues in the news. And I do hope that that's changing, but when I was freelance for a bit, I know I certainly found it hard to find a home for my stories about nature. Like I was frustrated with the lack of interest. And that's something, if you guys have questions about that, we can talk about a bit later. I would say that is sort of changing. But again, when you're thinking about which stories go to which paper, you need to be thinking about their readers' interests. And so you need to kind of tailor the way that you think about which stories work for which publication. So my tips on how to get into journalism: the most important thing you can do is, if you want to be writing as a journalist, as opposed to doing audio and video, which I think are really, audio and video are growing, they're really exciting areas to be working in. But if you want to do writing, you just need to start writing. And I was so terrible at writing when I started, but don't stop, just keep writing, and don't beat yourself up if you don't think that you're like, you know, if you feel that you're not a good writer or whatever. If you love the subject and you want to get good at it, you just keep doing it and you will get better. So I started writing blogs and working at the local paper, and like doing stuff now that I look back on and kind of think, oh, that wasn't very good, but it was really important to do. And remember that every step you take, you're going to get higher up the ladder. So you can't get the job that you want right now. You're going to have to go through all of those processes, and they're really important to do and will make you a better journalist for doing it. I would also, I don't know if you're on, one tool I find really useful is Twitter, and following journalists that you think are good, or people, researchers that you really like what they're writing about, scientists. It's a really good way of networking. And I found lots of young voices talking about nature who are like some of them like really interesting people doing stuff for the environment. I think you've got Greenfinger George on. Is he speaking tomorrow or something? I think I saw him on the list of speakers, but he's like one of many great young nature people.
Yeah, he's speaking later tonight actually at a, I think we've got a bit later on gardening and farming with nature. Yeah.
Okay, cool. So like following George on Twitter will get you inspired about stuff that you can do. Yeah, so I get on Twitter. I would also encourage you to set up a blog like I did and just keep writing, and ask people to go for coffees, like, or whatever. Ask to meet people who you think are interesting and you'd like to find out more about their work. I did so much of this. I have have a great debt to many other people who, when I was wanting to get into journalism, I just asked them to go for coffee and they gave me half an hour of their time. And it's so valuable to listen to other people's experiences. And actually, you may feel like you're being a burden. Well, I certainly did, but people quite like talking about themselves. And so, you know, they're not going to, if they agree to go for coffee with you, they're happy to do it. So, and if you don't ask, you don't get. So do network and meet people that you want to meet, and try and meet in person as well. I think it's really useful to meet people in person. So some of the challenges I overcame being a journalist, it's obviously a competitive industry to be in. So that in itself is, and having the confidence to like pitch stories and have, it's quite exposing when you're writing stuff and you know people are going to read it and people are going to criticize you. So you need to be prepared for that. And it's part of the job and you get used to it and people criticizing you for what you do. So that can be tough. I think they always say it's not who you know, it's it's not what you know, it's who you know. And in journalism, that's definitely true. Knowing contacts is really important, as I've kind of already spoken about. So it's never like too soon to start building up your contacts list. And when people, another thing I think's really important to do is always check back, acknowledge people who've helped you and send them an email and say thank you, and you know, keep in touch with people who are useful and make them aware that you're grateful for their help. So biodiversity reporting as a tool for change. I guess reporting on the state of the planet's nature is so important to hold people to account. And it often feels that I feel like my work isn't having as big an impact as I would hope it would have, but that, you know, there's lots of people feel frustrated that the world is not moving in the right direction when it comes to tackling the biodiversity and climate crisis. So it is, I really want to see change happening from my writing, and I don't see as much as I would like to, but we do make an impact, and I know that people really value the stuff that we put out, and it encourages more people to get involved, more people to protest, people better understand how serious the situation we're in is. So all that's really important. And so I think it's a very powerful tool being a journalist, and it's a responsibility as well to be accurate with what's happening. And the Guardian's had some like generally important, for instance, my colleague did an investigation into offsetting, and EasyJet has just announced it stopped doing carbon offsets as a result of that reporting. Six supermarkets have said they're going to drop meat sales related to deforestation in the Amazon. So all of this stuff is really great, and that's a result of good journalism. So how to send stories, or again, maybe we could pick up this more in questions, because I'm not sure what people want to know, but if you want to pitch stories to the media, like if you're a freelancer and you want to pitch stories that you could write, make sure that you make sure that you know what kind of thing that journalist writes about, or that, for instance, the age of extinction, what kind of stuff we write about before pitching stories. And think as well about different publications. So the Times is going to publish a different story to the Guardian, to the Daily Mail, to the Sun. So think about what that newspaper's line is on those issues, and you'll understand that by just reading a lot and reading what they're writing about. And I also feel that some of the papers like the Daily Mail and the Sun and the Express, those are the most, in some ways, they're the most important stories to get this issue. They're the most important papers to get this, to cover this issue, because they are speaking to people who don't think it's necessarily an issue or don't understand how serious these issues are. So I really encourage people to pitch to those papers as well as the Guardian, because you will be speaking to a different demographic of the population. And I think it's really important that everyone understands the importance of these issues. So, okay, what makes a good story? I think that lots of journalism is instinctive. So, you know, when someone tells you something, can you think, oh, that's cool, or whatever. If you have a reaction to something someone tells you, then that's a story. And we have a test, it's called the granny test or the pub test, which is probably a bit insulting to people's grandmothers. But the idea is that if you can't, you need to tell your story in like one sentence. And if you're going to tell it to someone in the pub or your granny and they're going to be interested, then it's a story. So with nature stories, it's all about making them accessible to average people who maybe don't like wetlands as much as you do, or like don't like Yorkshire National Park as much as you do. So it's all about making it relevant to as many people as possible. And our audience is national and international. So we can't do local stories unless they have a broader significance. And we love hearing about like the first time beavers are released here, or the biggest, or the best, or the loudest, or the smallest, lots of superlatives. Like, again, I think these are things that would appeal to children naturally in a way, or like in the sense that like we like hearing about new things. It's all about novelty and things that have never happened before happening. This is quite a garbled way of explaining like what makes a good story, but I think if you have to explain the story too much for someone to understand it, then it's not a good story. They're simple things. Again, sorry, yeah, go on, Max.
How do you kind of make that kind of simple and easy? Like, kind of, are there any kind of checks you go through before you publish a story, or kind of when you're going into writing, kind of,
yeah,
how are you thinking this kind of needs to be clear, or this term is kind of more complex than it has to be? Like, how do you kind of break that down when you're writing a story?
Yeah, there's a lot of dialogue between editors and writers about whether the terms are accessible enough. We want to make stuff as accessible as possible without losing like the accuracy. So I find what's a really good thing is if you've read a report or you've read something, I'm just going to turn on my screen light because this room has suddenly gone a bit dark. Okay. So you've read a report and you're kind of bogged down in it, or you've spoken to someone. What the best way to organize your story is to say it out loud to someone else, or say it out loud to your dog or whatever. Just tell me the story in like 10 sentences, and your brain will naturally, I think, order the story into like the most logical way or the most accessible way. So I still find that really useful. I'm like, right, what's the way into this story? Just say it out loud. What is the story? And again, speaking with colleagues and friends, is people will ask questions that maybe you hadn't thought of. So I think that's a really useful way of organizing it. And yeah, we're always trying to tell stories in a simple way, because it's important that people understand, as many people as possible can access them. I think I kind of finished with my monologue. I probably missed out loads of stuff, or like, I don't know, more details about, yeah.
No, there's a lot to unpack in that, so that's fine. Yeah, no, so many questions already that I've written down. I'll get started with a few before we get onto questions from people in the chat, which is great that they're coming through. Please add any questions that you have, any points you want to add, please just put them in the chat and we'll get through them if we can before 6 o'clock. I was actually going to start off with the kind of the brief that you have from the remit in terms of Age of Extinction. Is like that the name in itself is really kind of, I'm not going to say kind of provocative, but it's really kind of direct, and it's quite kind of, you know, it's almost scary in a way. It's like it's kind of even almost like epochal in the language it uses. Kind of,
yeah.
Did that draw you to, I don't know what the process was of kind of using that name, or if it was kind of in place before you started at the Guardian, but kind of, can you talk us more through that name and kind of what you take it to mean, and why you think it's kind of useful in a way?
Yeah, I have nothing to do with the name, so I couldn't like I couldn't talk to the thought process that went behind creating it. But I think I love the name because we are in the age of extinction. It's a 6th mass extinction. Like, the statistics on nature loss are so alarming, and that cannot be understated. And it's really important to be positive and tell people things that we can do, but you can't avoid the fact that we are in like a mass extinction event. So the name is totally accurate, in my opinion. And we always, again, have this issue editorially about, we want people to feel that there's hope, and there is hope, but we also want people to understand the significance of what's happening. And it's always a discussion that we have internally about making that balance correct, like giving people, not making people feel hopeless by the enormity of the situation that we have to tackle. So that's kind of an ongoing dialogue that we're having. But I would say, if you speak to the average person on the street, they wouldn't know the enormity of the biodiversity crisis. So I think that our number one job is to communicate that, and we need to think about how we do it. But in that respect, Age of Extinction is appropriate.
Yes, I think it's a really important point, kind of, which I think a lot of people in the environmental movement and just wider kind of struggle with. I think a lot of young people struggle with it. It's kind of, on one hand, the more it's kind of what Aldo Leopold, you know, says, that the disadvantage of an ecological education is kind of everywhere around you are the scars of that, and you see so much. And so it's almost, the more you know, the more daunting kind of the biodiversity and climate crisis is. But
yeah,
kind of that doomerism, but almost the more you know, also the more solutions and the more kind of innovation and the more inspiring stories, you know. So kind of, yeah, if you could talk more to that sort of balance of how to inform people about kind of the you know, the challenges that we face, but then also, like, I guess you don't have to try and do that in every story and be like, you know, on the, like a GCSE essay, on the negative side, this, but then also include a positive. I suppose you have to try and get that balance, not just in one story, but in general, in terms of the output. I don't know.
Yeah, no, I think your first point's really interesting about, there's lots of talk about how nature improves your mental health, like access to nature, but actually I find it quite bad for my mental health, because like, the more you find out, as you say, the more you realize in what a terrible situation we're in. So that's definitely, I find that quite an interesting like tension, the fact that you go and look at these beautiful landscapes and it's wonderful to see amazing landscapes, but you always know that they're often threatened, or amazing, like, but I was reading about bird migrations today, and like incredible long distance migrations, and the way these birds are designed to do them but equally, like birds are, I wrote an article that was published yesterday, half of the world's birds are in decline. So it's really tough, that. And I think in terms of like our overall coverage driving what I think is a good approach to this issue is that we make sure that we do a good balance of stories about community projects and people doing great stuff at grassroots level, because that is essentially what drives change. It's not enough in itself, but it's really important to report on that. And then on the other side, we have these really depressing reports. A lot of the science is obviously fairly depressing about nature loss. But we know what the 5 drivers of biodiversity decline are. We know what we have to do to address this issue. So we need to keep drawing people back to that, the fact that like we need to change the way that we farm landscapes. We need to change the way that we extract resources from nature. We need to change the way that we could like eat, the way that we shop, all of those stuff. But we know like the solutions are there. So in that sense, there is hope, and we need to guide action on those points. I don't really have, I mean, some people may think that we're not communicating this issue well enough. And my editor's always saying like, we need positive stories. And sometimes they can be hard to find, but they are really important to do. That doesn't really answer your question.
It's an interesting point about kind of what maybe, I don't know if it's readership or editors of both kind of print media and kind of broadcast journalism. It seems like there's all kind of always this tendency to think that doomist stories or depressing stories or stories of kind of woe and sadness or shock are kind of will grab attention and grab headlines kind of more than stories of kind of like inspiration and people doing good things. And it's like, I don't know if you found that at the Guardian or other publications worked out, but kind of how to persuade editors that maybe this story about this inspiring smallholder farm is actually, let's go with this one earlier on in the paper, or a more kind of prominent position than a story about a report on the decline of, I don't know, a certain like moth species or something.
Yeah. So at the Guardian, the editorially, I think we give good placement to positive stories. And I'm always being asked to write positive stories and our readers love positive stories. Like we get so on stories we write about actions that individuals can take, they always do really well. I know there's so many people out there, and obviously the people on this call, who want to do positive things. And so we do want to write stories about that, but equally we need to make it clear that individual action alone isn't enough to address this crisis. Like rewilding your windowsill is great and it will give you a sense of hope, and it's really important to do. And I've seen some questions about kind of anxiety and mental health in the question thing, and making sure that you are doing an action is going to be really good for your sense of well-being about this issue. So it's really important to do stuff, and don't think that it's too small. Yeah.
Nice. I think I'll go for a few questions in the chat just so we can make sure that we get through all of those. I mean, I have a ton more, but I think it'd be nice for people to get their questions answered first. Apologies in advance if I pronounce any of the names wrong. So the first one is from Alessia. They say, hello, a question please. How to balance rigorous and correct information and simplified information to reach a wider audience? I guess is an important point, because kind of a lot of this stuff can be kind of jargony or a lot of science-based. How to kind of translate that into readable kind of journalism that's accessible, like you said earlier?
Yeah, that's a question. We always have to deal with this, and it's really important to simplify stuff, and we want our articles to reach as wide an audience as possible. And I particularly think with biodiversity loss, it can be quite a complicated issue. I think it's actually more complex than some of the climate issues, because in climate you have carbon, and like we want less carbon in the atmosphere, whereas with biodiversity and land use change and stuff, it can be loads of factors having an impact. So I'm always trying to simplify things with that, and keeping it again, like being accurate. And again, another skill I find is that I've spoken to a researcher about a paper which is often full of jargon, and I'll just say to them, can you say this as simply as you can? Like, how would you distill this information? Because they know, you know, I'm not the expert, I'm reporting on experts who know their stuff. So I often ask them to say it as simply as they possibly can, and just ask them if I don't understand anything, I'll get them to repeat it. And I haven't got a background in science. Like I studied anthropology at university, so I am not an expert. And so I know that if I don't understand something, our readers aren't going to understand it either. So I basically use myself as a measure of how simple something needs to be in order for it to be clear to readers. So it's really important to question everything that you don't understand, and not be, I like make sure, because obviously you're speaking to a researcher who knows the topic really well, and you don't want to sound like stupid or something. But I just make sure that I don't, like, you know, you have to understand what you're writing.
That's interesting. It didn't come from a kind of like a natural sciencey background, because kind of, has that ever kind of, I don't know, like when you're applying to, like starting out as like an environmental journalist, was that ever, I don't know, like a concern? Do you ever feel kind of like slightly kind of worried about that at all? I think, because if I might be wrong, but I think Damien Carrington, the environment editor at the Guardian, I think he, before he went to the Guardian, was involved in Nature, the magazine,
Yeah,
the journal.
yeah.
So
I think he's got a PhD as well.
Yeah. So is that kind of, you know, did that kind of scare you at all, or kind of hurdles to overcome, or is it just kind of like you're interested in it enough, so that's all that kind of matters?
I remember when I started out, I never thought I would get a job at like the Guardian, because I looked through all of the journalists and I was like, wow, they've got really sciencey backgrounds. So yeah, that has intimidated me in the past, but it actually doesn't now. I don't even think about it. I just don't, as I say, I think it's really important. The most, like, my job is in communicating stuff. So I actually, in some ways, think as a non-expert, it's quite a good position to be in, because if I don't understand it, then other people aren't going to understand it. So I don't feel, and if, yeah, so no, it doesn't actually bother me now. But, and I think the reason I got into science journalism at first at the Mail Online is because I did 2 sciences at A-level. So I have like kind of sciencey-ish, but the Mail Online didn't have anyone sciencey in the building. So they were like, you're the most sciencey person we have. I was meant to go on news, and they said, you can do science instead. And I remember feeling really underqualified to do that. And I think as well, in terms of like the gender issue here, as a woman, I think you're more likely to feel underqualified. And like, I've felt like an imposter for a lot of my career. And it doesn't, like, stuff about, you know, your, like what you studied, it just doesn't matter. I don't think it matters. The quality of your work is what matters. So I don't have hang-ups about that now. And I would hope people listening to this call, if you haven't studied science at university, like, really don't let that be, don't let that hold you back at all. I wasn't asked about that in my interview here, and I don't think I was at any of my other jobs either.
Right. Sorry if I get your name wrong again. Rose Taylor asks, the world of environmental journalism can be a dangerous one, particularly when it comes to social justice and climate and nature. How do you and the team cope when events like the murder of Don Phillips happen? I don't know if you would speak on that more, or if you've ever kind of any stories where you've ever felt kind of, I don't know, any problematic issues, ethical issues, that kind of stuff.
Yeah, the Don Phillips murder is horrific. Everyone's very shaken by that. Yeah, I mean, we published a story today about environmental defenders getting killed for protecting the environment. I think one person is killed every 2 days protecting the environment. So it's horrific. And I haven't done any dangerous stuff like that, but my colleagues do. And there's a lot of protocol in place at The Guardian to make sure that people are safe and that we don't send people out on trips which are going to put them in danger. So we take that really seriously. When Don was murdered, he was researching for his book. So it wasn't a Guardian assignment that he was killed during. And I don't know, I know it was known to be a dangerous area. So yeah, it's difficult to cope with. I mean, I can't, yeah, it's horrific when stuff like that happens. And we're increasingly understanding that social justice and, it's climate justice, which is also nature justice. Like the people who are killed are often Indigenous peoples who are on the front line of protecting these places that they live in. It's part of their lives, and like, you can't protect the environment without protecting human rights. I often think, actually, in terms of protecting large areas of the Amazon, for example, the primary way to do so would be to protect human rights, because there are lots of Indigenous groups living in these parts of the world who are getting killed, and they have been living in these areas for thousands of years and have been living in harmony with them. They don't destroy them. So if you protect their rights, they will protect the natural world. So that's a huge issue for us, and we're always looking out for stories about people on the front line of protecting the environment.
Abbott asks, how do you appeal to an audience that isn't serious about environmental issues? I know papers like the Daily Express, for example, like to portray sharks as dangerous. So would these papers be willing to take on journalists who want to talk about protecting biodiversity?
That's a good question. You have to, yeah, I mean, I don't know how to answer that. I think there's a growing demand for journalists writing about climate, definitely, and nature biodiversity reporters. There's going to be more jobs in the future. Like, these publications will start to have people specializing in biodiversity at some point. I don't know when, but it is going to happen. Like, nature loss is going to touch all of our lives in a very direct way, in the way that we're seeing with climate. So you might still flick through those papers and think, like, God, how depressing, there's nothing on nature loss. But that will change. And in terms of appealing to an audience, if you're writing for those papers, you've just got to make it appeal to as broader people as possible. So I don't know how you make them like sharks, to be honest. That's a really tricky one. But you've got to think. So, for instance, with The Guardian, it's quite an easy sell to pitch an environment story to us, because we have lots of environment stories, but it's definitely harder. Like the Daily Mail, I did some work for them, and they're really into plastics. So if you have a story about plastics, you might consider writing it for the Daily Mail. And they're very interested in picking up plastics and like cleaning beaches and things. So I don't really know the Express well enough to sort of know what environment stories they'd be interested in, but good on you if you can get environment stories in those papers, I think, and important to do so.
I don't think this is the case for The Guardian, because I think it falls under kind of more kind of an environment heading rather than the climate heading. But I'm not sure if the BBC News tabs up the top kind of their business world. I'm not sure, I can't remember if it's environment or climate. And
I think it's science and environment, isn't it?
Okay.
I think so.
Well, I don't know if any of the other papers you worked at or kind of any of the kind of publications you've had stuff in, but sometimes kind of like biodiversity and nature just kind of gets subsumed under the climate heading. I don't know.
Yeah.
I'd bug you and annoy you, because I think it really would if it was me.
It bugs me. Yeah, it bugs me. Yeah. Yeah, it bugs me.
You think that just gets like so much more kind of attention in general? Because I think kind of the only time I can really remember a more kind of biodiversity and nature like story being the like headline on like BBC 10 is the UN's 1 million species kind of at risk of extinction report, and kind of you think that is kind of quite problematic that people kind of are often kind of spoken, they're so much more aware of like CO2 net zero than other kind of stuff.
Yeah, I completely do, and it frustrates me as well. And science tells us the biodiversity crisis is as serious as the climate crisis, so we should be having equal coverage in the news. So, which is kind of exciting, because I'm assuming the people on this call want to get into nature journalism, and there is going to be hopefully loads of jobs out there, which is unusual in journalism because it's a fairly, like, it's, you know, there aren't that many jobs going in journalism, but I really hope that there'll be way more on nature. And I'm hoping actually COP15 in December in Montreal will be a bit of a, like, there'll be more of a hoo-ha about that from like some of the publications that we've spoken about.
Alessia makes the question, to which extent do the trends of the kind of the current moment make an article kind of preferred from another which is dealing with a niche topic? So kind of, yeah, do you kind of I don't know, are there kind of buzzwords at the moment in environment nature which you think get a lot of attention, and maybe some things that get less, which kind of are of equal kind of importance, or that's kind of maybe hard to think of in the moment, but maybe you've got some thoughts.
Yeah, there's definitely trends. So often, like, for example, when the weather's hot, people are more concerned about climate change. Like, climate change stories do well when people are physically hot in the summer, because they're like, my God, it's so hot. And so that kind of becomes a trend for a bit. Or like rivers, I'd say a bit of a trend. River pollution, is much easier to sell a river pollution story at the moment. Or I mean, beavers seem pretty evergreen. People love beavers, but maybe that's slightly waning a bit. We've moved on from beavers. So there are trends, and it's not necessarily fair. Do you know what I mean? But like, it's important, if you're pitching stories, it's important to think about the trends, because you've got to think about what people want to read about at that time. So, and stories that are trending are likely to get more readership. One thing I would say is I get quite a lot of pitches about, you know, when they do like every day is like assigned a thing. So today is the day for, I can't even think of an example, but like, you know, those sort of like, today is International Women's Justice Day, or, you know, those like, and those markers, I would recommend not pitching on them. I get kind of emails being like, today is International Hedgehog Day. Like, how about a hedgehog story? That, in my opinion, is not a trend. Hedgehogs are good. People like hedgehogs, and they like bees, and they like big animals like wolves and bears and stuff as well. And less interested in other insects, which is just unfair, because insects are awesome and probably a lot more important. But it's much harder to sell a story about an insect compared to a wolf, and that's just like how people are.
And kind of begs the question of how much does this kind of journalism have to follow that, or how kind of those, not just trends, but kind of interest in that general sort of culture, like even going back to the point about sharks, and but kind of our general kind of hierarchy of what we find important in the natural world, ranging from kind of animals that might look like us right down to, you know, fungi, lichen, who we can't, you know, necessarily relate to as much. And do you think journalism kind of more has to just follow that, or is there any kind of space to kind of try and kind of set that trend? It's difficult.
Yeah, it's difficult because it isn't just in journalism, it's in like academia as well. The research that goes into big predators is way and above anything that goes on to insects and things. So it's not just journalism, and kind of, I mean, you have to give into it. Like, I have to pitch stories that my editor's interested in, and she's interested in bears or something more than a moth. So that's just, partly you have to accept that. I've also tried to do stories about weird stuff. Like I really like hedgerows, and I like soil, and I like parasites. And so I've pitched and done features on those stories in the aim of getting people more interested in them. And in a way, there's kind of that sort of a hook, isn't it? Like the soil is the sort of the poor man's tropical rainforest or something, and you like sort of go into the soil. That's the fact that it's so underrated is kind of interesting.
Rose has another question, and I think it's really important, especially for a lot of young people. How do you cope with kind of eco-nature anxiety? And kind of a point we've spoken about, kind of with so much information and so much kind of, you know, like problems and so many things to think about. Kind of how do you, I suppose as well, kind of can you kind of really kind of like relax and take a break from that and just kind of put work to one side?
This is it's not like I mean, I feel really anxious and sad about a lot of the stuff I write, so I know exactly what you mean, and it's really difficult. I would say ways to make yourself kind of feel better about it is to like do things what I imagine you're doing now. Talk to other people who care about these issues, join groups, campaign, protest, like do stuff. And even small actions can make you feel like you are contributing. And so I'd really encourage you to do those things. They're really important. And it's important if you want to continue to like make a difference on this issue, you need to look after yourself. So you need to make sure that you can switch off from it, because if you can't, then in a way you're not going to be able to like, you know, help in the way that you do. Because if you're not, you know, you have to be feeling like healthy and like well in order to do that. So and another thing I would say is that in terms of like eco-anxiety, it's a completely normal reaction to what you're reading. It would be weird not to feel anxious actually about the stuff that we're reading. So don't feel that don't feel that you're unusual or it's something wrong with you. It's not at all. It's a totally normal reaction to the events that are happening. And so be good to yourself.
Yeah, I think that's a really important point. And I suppose the more kind of people talk about things and just kind of, I think trying to think about what you think about things and trying to understand what you're thinking about them and why is really important. I think we've kind of addressed Max's question. How do you find a good balance between the negatives and positives? And Heather asked, how do we keep getting press attention for ongoing issues that still aren't being addressed by industry or policymakers, such as harmful chemical pollutants, which is a really relevant question in terms of our 60th anniversary of Rachel Carson's Silent Spring and kind of all the chemical pollutants that go into agriculture and that sort of stuff.
Yeah, and Heather's point just after that about pictures really help. It's so true. always take pictures. Always take pictures. It's so important in selling a story that there are images with it. And generally take your images in landscape, not portrait if you can, and videos as well, like as much media. Lots of publications, that's like the sort of second question they ask. If they like the story, what images do we have to go with it? And then back to the first question. It's difficult. Like I got a story recently about river pollution, and I could tell the river pollution was bad, but there's so many stories about, we know the rivers are really polluted, and so you can't keep telling the same story. In a way, you need to like make it new or discover something new. So it is hard to find stories in that. I mean, one thing, for example, is a nice way of looking at pollution stories. Is there a really remarkable individual who's doing something to combat pollution and is like, you know, again, a positive story about a village that got bathing status for their polluted river is a really lovely story. So it's important to insert people in environment stories, because people relate to other people, and if you've got good characters doing stuff, then I think that really enlivens a story. So I would recommend, yeah. I mean, I kind of can't really answer your question, Heather, because it is really hard to get coverage. For stories which we all know, like the pollution from agriculture, we know it's really bad, but like, and we do report on it, but how do you keep reporting on it to make change? It's difficult. And as well, we always, as journalists, you might feel very frustrated. It's like, why won't they take the story? It's very important, but it's because my editor's been like, our readers won't see why we should be covering that. So I'm kind of have to answer to her as well as campaigners and stuff, so it's difficult.
On the kind of you mentioned it quite early on in your talk, but kind of just picked up on it there, kind of when we think about kind of what the point of journalism is, and what do you think kind of your kind of what you're trying to do with your environmental biodiversity reporting and journalism is, kind of how much is it kind of informing, and how much of it is kind of campaigning, because you kind of just mentioned there kind of campaigns, and you mentioned earlier kind of you've kind of felt kind of depressed at kind of the stories that you've been kind of writing, and issues there hasn't been so much done in terms of like the government and the action side of things. It's how much do you see kind of your journalism as a campaigning, and also kind of does that help in terms of your kind of your own personal kind of relationship with the natural world and kind of eco anxiety, like, you know, you feel like kind of, yeah, I'm doing something here, it kind of
yeah,
way.
My job definitely makes me feel better about that. I think in terms of the campaigning, it's an interesting question, because I often get asked about like being a campaigning journalist, but actually I'm just writing on the science. Like a lot the policies and is so far behind the science, and it actually shouldn't really be campaigning. It's just following the science on these issues. So like having rivers that are not full of sewage, again, I don't think that should be campaigning. That's just, we shouldn't have rivers full of sewage. That's just, and like we know what is driving biodiversity decline because of science, so we need to change those things. So I don't really feel like I am campaigning. I speak to campaigners obviously, but again, their work is based on the science behind this issue. So I don't really see myself as a campaigner. And the other point, the first point about informing people, there's such nature illiteracy in our country. And so again, part of my job is I love nature and I want to write about it and hopefully get other people to love it as well. So part of it is kind of just informing people about amazing animals and things like that.
And in terms of kind of the kind of the emotion of kind of like what you're reporting, do you ever kind of my phone turn off? The perils of being live in the living room. In terms of kind of the emotion of environmental loss and extinction and the age of extinction, kind of is there a place for emotion, and what sort of place does emotion have in reporting on the environmental kind of crises in the natural world?
Yeah, I think emotion should be separate from reporting. So we report on stuff, and then I've done a comment piece, for example, on reporting. I think it's coming out on Saturday, but like a comment piece on my experience of reporting about biodiversity for 3 years, where I would say how I feel about it, but I wouldn't put that in reporting because there's no place for it. It's not about my emotions. I really like capturing other people's emotions in features that I write about them, because I think emotions are powerful and everyone has emotions, and like relating to how someone feels. If someone's telling you about the destruction of their local wetland actually the most powerful way they can do that is by telling you how it made them feel. And we all are very much driven by emotions. So I think that's a really powerful way of telling stories about environmental loss.
And I'm conscious of the time. We're kind of nearly at the end. A final question from me then is, in terms of kind of the future of kind of environmental nature journalism, and kind of what you've worked in terms of print and paid for journalism, kind of, are you kind of, would you say you're more worried, or are you more hopeful about the future of kind of print environmental journalism? Because, you know, kind of a subscription-based model, a sales kind of advertising model is changing with the landscape of kind of more digital kind of journalism, and kind of what is kind of, you know, what does the future hold for that sort of journalism?
I can't really talk about sort of like the strategy of different papers in terms of like that different models, because I am not involved in it. But I would say that there is going to be more appetite for journalists to write about nature, and I think that's positive. And so I think that this is going to snowball what is starting now. I think, for instance, I think I'm the only, or me and my colleague Patrick are the only biodiversity reporters that I know of. So there's two of us in like all publications. Of course, people do write about wildlife loss, but we're like dedicated to doing that. And so I think that number is going to grow. And so in that sense, I think there's a bright future for nature or biodiversity reporters. But in terms of what we're reporting on, I think it's going to get worse before it gets better.
Brilliant. Well, thank you so much for that. It's really, really interesting, really insightful, and thank you for all of your questions. So just a few things to wrap up on that. We've got more events. We've got a few more events, I think. We've got one tonight, UK to Nature hosting a panel on gardening and farming with nature. And then we've got a talk tomorrow on wildlife photography, which will be really interesting. So maybe you should go to that and get a few photos for your stories. Who knows? There might be some good ones there.
Definitely go to that talk.
Yeah. And please follow UK Youth for Nature on Twitter and Instagram. That's our handle, UK Youth for Nature. We are the UK's leading youth organisation dedicated to creating a movement and that kind of includes the youth voice in thinking about the natural world and campaigning and the politics side of nature, which we didn't even have time to get onto, but it's a very ever-changing landscape, a kind of a frightening one, but also one that's more people are getting involved in, and that gives me a lot of hope and strength to go forward. Yeah, that's about it really. We're celebrating 60 years since the publication of Rachel Carson's Silent Spring. She said, in nature, nothing exists alone. And I think just importantly, in society, none of us exist alone. And coming together as a movement and getting involved in these things together is so important. It empowers all of us kind of politically, but also personally. So if you'd like to get involved in more environmental campaigning, please join, please follow UK to Nature. And we hope to see you all again soon. But until next time, have a nice evening, everyone. Goodbye.
Thanks for having me.
Thank you very much for coming.